Welcome to How We Get Through, the podcast where we share stories, mental health insights, and healing advice on life's everyday challenges. I'm your host, Jen, a licensed therapist and founder of the How We Get Through app. Today's guest is Emily King, a licensed psychologist in North Carolina. In this episode, Dr. Emily walks us through her personal journey with neurodivergence and her brave efforts to be a light on how parents and teachers can collaborate to get the best outcome for our neurodivergent kids. We'll tackle teacher shortages, explore the power of language, and discover the beauty of neurodivergence. Listen in for this perspective-shifting conversation. Hi, and welcome back to the How We Get Through podcast. Today, so excited, we have Dr. Emily King, who's a child psychologist and former school psychologist in North Carolina. She consults with parents who are raising neurodivergent children and teens. Her professional journey, as well as her personal journey as a parent, has brought her to understand the profound importance of nurturing the strengths and respecting the lived experiences of autistic individuals. In addition to her work with parents, she's on a mission to help educators better understand and connect with their neurodivergent students. As Dr. Emily likes to say, nurturing neurodivergent kids isn't about changing them, it's about changing us. Ooh, so good. Dr. Emily, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
This is so exciting. Okay, so we like to start off every show with a mental health myth, and I'm sure you have a ton. So we would love to know yours.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind as a child psychologist, child therapist, doing counseling with children, all the things, is that therapy is going to fix all of the child's problems, would be the myth. And I am all for some generalization, normalization of therapy for all. Like, it's so good that all the kids these days have a therapist and they're all talking about it, and it's not stigmatized to get pulled out of school to see your therapist. It kind of depends on where you are in the country, but I'm seeing rapid growth with all of that wonderful just acceptance of mental health providers and care. However, if the pendulum swings too far, we are going to forget about all the other stuff that is so important outside of the therapy room for mental wellness, like sleep and play and safe family connections, and just being in a routine and, being around all the things that you're interested in. So I think sometimes I have to actually talk parents into pausing therapy sometimes. And it's more about their anxiety of, will I have availability if they need to come back? That's one thing. But also about, but my child's making progress. And the thing to think about is, yes, they're making progress, but they're developing. So they're going to be these plateaus we come up against of like, I've taught them all I know at this developmental age, or I feel like they've, achieved insight or emotional regulation to the extent that I think they can at this developmental age. And let's pause. And I call it taking the show on the road. Like, let's go out in the community. Let's go use those skills and then circle back and come back to me when we feel like something new has come up that a child is ready to learn again. So there's kind of a revolving door in my work of families coming off and on my caseload. And I don't think kids are supposed to be seeing a therapist for 10 years straight. Like, that's just a myth that I think, more therapy is not necessarily the answer. So that's what I would kind of in a nutshell talk about in terms of a myth to help parents feel like they have some answers outside of therapy too, especially because this is expensive work, sometimes not covered by insurance, depending on where you're living, and not being able to find necessarily a provider in your area. There are a lot of things parents can do to support mental wellness, even outside of therapy, says the therapist.
Right, exactly.
Right.
It's so true. And I think for parents and non-parents, the idea, and I fully believe this as a therapist myself, is like you aren't supposed to be in therapy forever. And I can imagine in the developmental stages for kids, how important that is to learn and then go and try and see, and how scary that is for parents to like take the bumpers off or take the training wheels off or having to maybe re-engage with your child in a certain way, or be that regulator for them, or be the bumpers for them. I can imagine that's like scary.
Right. But it's so incredibly important for a child to depend on themselves, to depend on a whole group of people, their teacher, their friends' parents, their coach. They need to learn to trust a bigger network of people outside of just their home or just their therapist. And in addition to trusting themselves to be able to solve problems. And so as soon as we can help kids get independent in their emotional regulation, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what is the parent's role in that? Like, is it obviously to get them in, but then also trusting you that now they can take it over or observe their child doing really well?
Yeah, so it depends on what the presenting concern is. Sometimes when I see really young children, I'm modeling for the parent how to engage their child in play if their child is playing in a way that is different from what they expected. And so some of it is really coaching the parent on joining their child in play or joining their child in social interactions. But then in more, what we think of as traditional child therapy, where a child is talking to us and explaining their feelings, my role really is to give that child a space that is obviously confidential and separate from parents. But then I do probably half of my practice is parent work. And so I'm wanting to help that parent feel empowered and know what to ask and know what to let go of, so that they can balance that relationship with their child. And yes, they're always going to be the parent, and I'm going to be the therapist. So, just like, my kids, like they're going to tell somebody else before they tell me something probably. But so it's hopeful to have, let me say that again. It's helpful to have other people in their life, but I hope that the family role and the parent role is to learn that balance of supporting their child, giving them space to grow, but it's finding the balance of what do they need support with, what do they need me to step back on and need independence with. And that's mostly what I try to coach parents on in their role, especially when kids are growing up with asynchronous skills, which is all the children I work with, are not following the, traditional expected milestone chart that the pediatrician gave them. And so we are following skills, and sometimes it's a mystery. Sometimes is we don't know when the skill is going to unfold, but we just do the next thing to support and helping parents understand that.
Well, I love that. And so as a parent and a clinical psychologist, tell me the story of how you got started. How did you land into this niche, and where's your kind of heart or drive in all of this?
Yeah, so I have written about this before, actually went in a lot of depth on my Substack one time, telling everyone what school was like for me. So it kind of started then. I was a very anxious student who learned how to do the system. I checked the boxes, I turned the things in, I was a really good student. And somewhere along the way, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. My mom was a teacher. I, of course, thought I wanted to be an English teacher because I love to write. My mom's an English teacher. I'll do that. And then later on, I was halfway through my bachelor's degree in English to become an English teacher, I decided I really did not like Shakespeare at all. And it's I can't teach this stuff. So I had not yet discovered that my heart is really with little kids. I for some reason was thinking, I love English. I want to be a teacher. I'll be a high school English teacher. So that all evolved. And then I, at the same time, kind of took my first psychology course and was oh, I love human stories. This is what I love. So there was this mix of I love stories and I love reading, but I don't love all the reading, but I like the human experience. And then I ended up double majoring in psych and English just because I had already taken all the English courses. And then I discovered school psychology, which was, of course, doing psychology in a school with kids. And it was all the things together. So so my doctorate is in school psychology. I worked as a school psychologist for 5 years. And that's where I really started to get into all the things. It was always so complex, and I loved the complex things. So all the things that were interfering with a child's learning. I was trained to measure their learning. I was trained to give recommendations on how we can make learning better. But there was all this emotional behavioral stuff and developmental stuff that was always interfering. And then, of course, there could be trauma and there could be all other things that were happening with kids that were getting in the way of their learning. So as I evolved in my work, I decided to be in private practice so I could do more, just a wider scope of consultation with teachers and parents and more therapy. And then my kids were here. So my oldest son was born, and we started having some concerns about his development about the time he was 3. And then I realized that, okay, so I know a lot about this, yet this is a really emotional journey. It doesn't matter how much I know about child development and what I knew exactly what I was looking at. I knew what was happening, but it was still so overwhelming to me. So over time, I tried not to work with families going through the exact same thing I was going through at that moment. But as I kept going and he kept growing and I kept kind of mastering things, like I knew what I was doing clinically, but when I felt like I had kind of emotionally mastered it and felt that moment where I could tell a parent like, oh, I got you. I know what to do about this, and it felt like confident. That's been really rewarding. He's now 15. So I work with a lot of younger parents now that are younger than I am and are new to the journey of having their child be on a different developmental path. And it's a really rewarding. And I still work with kids in my practice as well. And then that's evolved, of course, to start helping teachers because after my work in the schools and just watching all my clients, not just my son, but all my clients at different times struggle with how standardized our American education system is. I just want to help teachers better understand our kids because so many of their mental wellness concerns stem out of what we're asking them to do that just doesn't fit their brain.
Yeah. And do you feel that as a parent too, like that experience of like having your kid be in school and like it's not structured right for him or them?
Yeah. So, I mean, he has an individualized education plan, which he's had since he was 3. So we, by law, meet once a year to revise that, to update that. But every single year is a different conversation and a different brainstorm of like, what can we change about within certain, realm? What can we change about how the structure of the day goes, or about now that he's in high school, like the different classes he has, what can we change about that to help it be more accessible to his attention span, to his social anxiety, to the way that he, leans into his interests. So those are all things that I encourage all parents to think about. There are ways to tweak within our, within our special education laws that we have. But also, just within the relationships you form with your child's teachers, you don't have to have a lot of, legal documents in place. Some kids absolutely need that support, but just helping your child understand your kid. And if they want your kid to be able to access their education in the best way they can, then just being open about that and talking about that with them.
Yeah. And do you have a pulse on like how teachers are doing right now?
I feel like I do because I've been presenting to them and based on the questions they ask, I can definitely tell, it depends on where you are in America right now. I think that because it stinks that it's this way, but because of how the money flows in education, you can see differences in burnout.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a, national teacher shortage. That's true anywhere you go. But I think the pulse is that teachers are exhausted, just like parents are exhausted. We need more funding for professional development. We need more funding for assistants, teaching assistants, because those people are amazing. They are underpaid, and they are the ones that help teachers in these moments where their attention is divided and they need to help multiple children. So there are needs that we need to meet, but in general, I feel like the heart is still there. Like if teachers are still in it at this point after COVID, they really want to be a teacher and they are in it and they are dedicated, but the burnout is real. They all need the summer break. They all need to be very supported with, their administration and their self-care. I talk to teachers a lot about burnout and self-care. They cannot be there for their students if they are feeling overwhelmed and, they're just feeling like they have no energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I give my hats off to teachers. Like, I get overwhelmed.
Oh my goodness.
You children. I'm like, I can't even imagine. My dad and stepmom are teachers. They actually met teaching, which is really cute story. They married later in life, but I remember going into their classroom and being like, just really overwhelmed. I think also as a therapist, I'm like, how is everybody doing emotionally? And then trying to like teach something or it's just there's just so many layers, right? And they're with our kids like majority of the time, right? And so it's just an important job that I think we can like, as parents take for granted or feel like we're at war, especially if our kid needs something else. And so what I'm hearing you say too is like, how do we collaborate with our teachers? How do we collaborate with our schools so that we can provide the best care and work as a team to get our kids through?
Yeah, as you know, I'm just so passionate about this topic because I don't feel like we can make progress for kids until all the grown-ups can get along and solve problems together. So, as you can imagine, in the last 20 years, I've seen all kinds of types of meetings of, parents being, really overwhelmed and coming in feeling, like they need to take charge and tell everybody what to do. And then teachers can feel very defensive to that. So we have to remember that teachers are the expert of their classroom. We are the expert of our home, but then our kid could look different in those two settings. Like, we're kind of all the expert of the kid. Like, yes, they're ours, but I don't know what my kid looks like specifically when they're struggling with reading. That's something that I can trust and respect my teacher's opinion on. The one thing I always say to teachers and parents is always look for what is working. I think we often come into meetings or come into parent-teacher conferences and we start with that, oh, this is the concern. Or of course, that's where our anxiety goes as parents. We have a concern, so we need to schedule a meeting.
Yeah.
But when we get to that problem-solving space, which is where all the collaboration happens, I'm always interested in knowing, okay, what is working? When does this kid pay attention? When does this kid communicate? When does this kid look happy? When are they engaged? When are they independent? There are all kinds of answers to those questions that will help parents and teachers say, you're right. When they're at home doing this is successful. Or saying, I've finally figured this out. We had the hardest time with the morning routine, but I made it a visual checklist and it worked. So I don't know what this would look like in the classroom, but at home, this is what it looks like and it worked. And so trusting, like sharing ideas, but trusting teachers to translate that into their setting is one of the best things we can do to build that collaboration.
Okay, I don't know if this exists, but does a therapist, can there be someone like you, a psychologist, in that room in all those meetings? And that's not what you want to do, but should that be a part of an IEP meeting? How is everybody feeling? Or kind of a little bit monitoring in a way. Mediating, but also because it almost feels like the psychological part of it's missing in some way.
Well, a lot of times the school psychologist will serve in that role, although there aren't enough school psychologists either. Often the school administrator will serve in that role, whether it's the principal or the assistant principal, but those are not standardized training approaches. You might get an administrator or a school psychologist that understands the dynamics of the room and helps everybody come together. But that, of course, is not always going to happen. So there is no job for that. But that is certainly a role that it's very helpful to have. That's why when I do my parent training, I have a whole lesson on collaborating with teachers. And when I do my teacher training, I have a whole lesson on collaborating with parents, because we can't make someone else collaborate with us, but we can show up and collaborate with them. So that's at least how I'm trying to
feeling that
infiltrate the problem and spread the positivity of collaboration.
Yes, but it is like the bridge, right? I think
Yeah.
that's what, when you're talking about, like, man, the bridge is missing. And we're actually just wanting the same thing, right? And so how
Everyone's just wanting the kid to have the support that they need to be successful.
right, exactly. Well, which is so interesting because when we were talking about making a course for the app, we kind of wanted to start a little bit at square one, of like how to know when or if your kid has autism. And so I just want you, if you can like talk about that a little bit. Why is like that first step so important, or what is important to kind of like understand emotionally as you're going through that?
Yeah, I think for parents, this is the emotional part where we can get stuck. And it's all about our fear. It's all about our fear of, what's going to happen in their development. Oh, I have concerns about my child's development. If I just dismiss it, maybe it's nothing and I don't do anything about it. That's also, of course, a strategy to avoid our fear. And so when I start working with parents, they are usually have recently gotten a diagnosis of some kind for their child, and they're ready to learn. They're ready to soak up all the knowledge, and they've accepted that this is the path. Like my kid is on this kind of unknown path. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm here for it kind of vibe. And there's some mental wellness work that goes on before you get to that point that I've personally been through. Again, even though I clinically know all the things, I still had to process that my kid's going to need something different. And it wasn't just accepting that. It was surrendering to the idea that I don't even know what it is he's going to need, which for me, as my perfectionistic box checker good student self, had a really hard time with. So that is something that I've been through a lot of personal growth on. So when we were talking about creating this module that's kind of like before someone would be ready to dive into all the learning about supporting your kid and all those things, you've got to be in the right headspace to be ready to accept all of that and be ready to do some of that work. And part of getting in that headspace is recognizing that fear. Okay, I think my kid might have some symptoms of autism, or I think they might be autistic. So we need to think about a few things, and who do we talk to, and how do I figure this out? Because there's several different ways, depending on where you live and what resources you have available. There's several different ways to answer this question. And then all the emotions that go along with that journey of basically going from being worried or wondering. And I want to say, I say worried and wondering because some parents worry because there's a lot of stigma around autism. And some parents, we're losing our stigma a teeny bit. It's moving, but it's still here with us. And some parents are like, I wonder if that's an autistic thing to do. So I kind of think of it like when we were in high school, ADHD was like a thing, right? Like we knew kids with ADHD medicine had kind of just come out in terms of being FDA approved. So people were talking about it more. So no one was really talking about autism as like, there were no autistic adults or autistic teenagers out there talking about that. Everyone thought of autism as a sad thing that you couldn't do a bunch of stuff if you had that diagnosis. And that is no more. Yes, there are more moderately or severely impacted individuals with intellectual disabilities. But in the course that we're speaking about, that in my work and then in our pre-module work or whatever we want to call it, is more about you're trying to help people around your kid understand them better, and they have all these asynchronous skills. So on some level, you're like, well, maybe it's fine. They're really smart. They're verbal. Maybe it's fine. And there are lots of things that can be hard for a child who is smart and verbal, or smart and speaking, that still need to be supported. And we just want to get at it and get in there and start helping. And at the same time, help parents get on board to not parent from a place of fear, but work on that level of, it's really the acceptance of the unknown. It's not necessarily, yes, you're accepting like, okay, my kid needs something different than what I expected, but I always come back to, why? Who are we to be expecting these things? Like, why? Why did we think that we were? I mean, like, you have a child and you get what you get, y'all. Like, it's just part of the deal. And I do think that I do see a little bit of evolution in younger generations, like parents who are, between like 10, 15 years younger than I am, like in their 20s and 30s, that, think more like, well, I'm going to get what I get. And I don't, for some reason, I got the message that like you hope for the best. I'm like, what is the best? Like, they're all wonderful. It's just different.
Right. But I think that goes back to it being like stigmatized and not well supported or well known or a part of the world, a part of our lives. It was always something that's like on this outside or this outskirt or other thing.
It was very othered when we were growing up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of work that the younger generation is doing of like, what would it look like if nobody was othered in this way? And so
yes,
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, totally. But I want parents to know too, if you are having a fear reaction to that, it probably has to do with some early thoughts or experiences about kids or individuals with disabilities being othered. That's where your fear is coming from. That's why I talk about we got to change the world for our kids. They're already wonderful. Yes, we're going to support them and we're going to help them build skills and be more independent, but they don't need to not be autistic. We don't need to change the autism. We just want to help them be less anxious. We want to help them be happier, find their interest. And so it's really about helping the world around them, not other them, which is what our fear is doing to us in that moment.
Yeah. And I think too, like, I feel like the answer to that is connection in some ways, right? Like if we are connected to someone who has autism, or if we're connected to another parent that has an autistic kid, like we're in relationships with people. We're like able to connect to someone else on a human level and not, again, have it be on the outskirts or this other piece where it becomes fearful because we don't know it. Right. And so like getting to know it, getting to be in relationships with people is so important, I think, in this like global idea of healing and how we all work together and how we all like heal together. I don't know if that's so like woo woo, but I'm like, God, like
it's so true.
We need it.
It's so true. And we're kind of in the middle. I mean, we mentioned the younger generation a minute ago. We're in the middle of like, depending on the age of the person, you've had a totally different experience with autism.
Totally.
Like older people think about Rain Man. I mean, that's like all they know. And then younger people are like, oh, my coworker's autistic. I mean, it is like a vast difference between this just what you've experienced. So going back to community, if you aren't in community, like right now with other parents raising autistic kids or, talking to your colleagues about educating autistic students, if you're not in community with those people, you're completely falling back on your previous experiences, which may not be accurate anymore because this is like rapidly evolving. I mean, even in the work that I've done in the last 15, 20 years, even thinking back to things I had or conversations I had or things I read 15 years ago is like just not even at all the mindset in general about neurodivergence wasn't even being talked about 15 years ago.
Right. I was just going to say the language
is changing.
Changing, right? Because we are evolving or we are changing or we're evolving in the way that we're seeing things. And so that language has to change with it as well. And I love if you can give us like a snapshot or timeline around language and how it's important and how it's evolved.
Yeah. So kind of the long story short is that recently we have the privilege of listening to autistic adults and autistic teenagers tell us how they think about the language. And prior to that, the medical model or the deficit model is what we would think of is really what's driven the language. So in the DSM over the years, it's been autistic disorder, it's been autism spectrum disorder, it's been Asperger's, it's been all the things in a variety of ways that really is all the same thing. I personally dropped the word disorder in terms of just like saying it and talking about it. Probably 5 or 10 years ago, it just never really felt like that was the part of the child that was disordered.
Yeah.
The stuff that we're working on is the anxiety and the happiness and the connection, building that connection and helping kids feel more comfortable from a sensory and emotional regulation standpoint. So it's been really enlightening to listen to autistic adults and teens who are able to explain that many of them, this isn't for everyone. I always just follow how anyone identifies with their language, just like we do for gender. But I think that it makes sense when I hear autistic adults say, I can't separate myself from my autism. It would be like me saying I'm a person with giftedness. Like I can't separate myself from that. And so I always say, if we would say I'm a gifted person, we would say I'm an autistic person. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, respect that when a person tells me that that's how they think of themselves. And we need to listen to those stories because that's their experience. You'll hear all these terms used interchangeably depending on who you're talking to. Of course, the medical model and the medical profession often still uses, diagnosed with autism, or, people all the time will still say, I think my child might have autism, but I'm just throwing it out there for documenting purposes of, at the time of this podcast, the language is evolving. And I love that we are using the words neurodiversity and neurodivergence more because, and just to clarify the difference between those two, we are all neurodiverse, and then some of us are neurodivergent. So autistic individuals, people with ADHD, giftedness and twice exceptionality, which would be giftedness and a learning disability. Lots of people are identifying as neurodivergent. And I think it's a helpful word because we're able to talk about our children if we need someone to understand them without getting super specific or telling their whole life story. Or people just have a more general word to use that's becoming much more understood and accepted, because the thing to understand, of course, is that every single person is different. And so that's if you find out that a child there's an autistic student in your child's class, that should be the very first thing you find out. It should never be the last thing. You should then say, okay, well, tell me about them. Like, it doesn't mean that they're into one certain thing that you heard this other autistic kid was into. Like, it can be totally something different. So it's the patterns that are similar, but the actual individuality of the person is completely specific, like all human individuality. So I'm hoping that we're just starting the conversation on language and really listening to how our kids describe themselves. And of course, this changes as I work with children over time. So usually around adolescence, they'll start figuring out, their strengths and their needs for support. And some kids will decide, I feel pretty comfortable saying I'm an autistic person, and some don't feel comfortable with that. So we just follow their lead as they develop in their independence. And it really comes down to how they want to self-advocate, how they want to explain themselves to teachers, to professors, to coworkers, and in a way that is helping them empower themselves and feel confident, and at the same time being able to ask for any accommodations or supports that they need to be successful.
Yeah, man, I love that. It's when we talk about the old language around like autism spectrum, when you're talking about it, though, it does feel like that scale where I think we say neurodivergent is one thing. Here's this one thing that every child is going to be and represent the same thing. And I just love your education around how unique, don't forget we're all unique, right? Don't forget, we're actually human beings. So it's going to show up in different ways for different people. And I think even as a parent, right? That can be terrifying and also really relieving at the same time, is oh, my child still gets to be unique in its own person. And so this idea of being really curious and kind of like, I think like just not like responsive, but just like observing, right? Like how are they showing up in the world? How are they experiencing the world, especially if they're not as verbal yet? Well, obviously when they're verbal, we can like engage in a little bit more of that conversation, but you do this anyway as a parent, no matter what, is like, you're like, they're born into this world and you're like, okay, guys, like, you know, try not to bump into things, but they are so unique in their own ways. And so how do we nurture that in the same way with neurodivergent, right? Like, how are we going to nurture this for you? And again, I love that part of like just seeing your strengths in this, because what is the line you say of like,
it's not about changing them, it's about changing us.
Yeah.
So nurturing neurodivergent children is not about changing them.
But it was just such a reframe of like seeing like neurodivergence as like a strength, or what real, like what good can come with that, or what uniqueness can come with that, versus again this like doomsday or one negative thing that someone's going to get slapped this label on and this is going to be the rest of their life. Like it's just so multifaceted. Is like,
yeah,
I'm like getting like,
yeah, well, it's the thing that I want everyone to understand is, of course, like you said, we're human. We're all individuals. Every single autistic person is also an individual.
Right.
And yes, there's some patterns of things for autistic people that are similar. There are also patterns for neurotypical people of, like, we love eye contact. What's that about?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I mean, we just love it. We like read between the lines and like we like guess what you're saying, and you don't even tell us directly. Like, I don't know, they're just patterns that we have. And when you think about it that way, I often explain to kids and to parents, especially because lots of kids I work with are into technology. I'm like, it's like iOS and Windows. Like they're just different. They both work really well. They're just different. But the whole world is built for Windows. And if you're in iOS, like you're going to have some trouble because like the buttons are all in different places.
Right.
And so I like that analogy just because it helps us think through like the flexibility of like, I figured out how to work my MacBook after I used Windows my entire education career. Like I figured it out, so we have to lean into, yes, these are differences, but they don't have to be scary. The parts that are hard are actually not the autistic parts. It's the anxiety and the sensory overwhelm and the difficulty with emotional regulation. And yes, those things are all hard, but like, lining up trains, nothing wrong with that. Let's line up some trains together, right? So there's some older ways of thinking that tried to change the play of autistic children, or tried to change, kids who only like to talk about a certain topic. Well, if you want to, if you have social goals to be more flexible in conversation, then that's a goal we can work on. But you could also find a friend who loves to talk about dinosaurs as much as you do, and y'all are going to have an awesome time.
Yeah.
So they're just things that we can change for our kids, because they're going to have such asynchronous skills and be good at something and need support in something else, and not go with that time frame of the expected development, which is what our education system is built around. And helping them, validating them on, if you want to learn that thing, let's go learn that thing. So going back to your question of like, how do we follow our children? We follow the interests and we follow the joy. And that's what we do with everybody, right? It's just that our kid may not be into what our traditional culture is built around. We might not have a sporty kid. We might not have a kid who likes to write, likes to, make up imaginary stories. That just might not be their thing. And we just might have to work a little harder to find community for our kids' thing, because it may not be in the traditional school or the traditional, religious establishment or community. We may have to that's the part of my work with families of like, we just got to think outside the box and find the community for our kids. And it's about following their interest and their happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I just hear you like flipping the script on so many things that honestly just brings so much ease into parenting a kid who's neurodivergent. Like, it just feels like, oh, what if this wasn't wrong, right? Like, what if this just was different? And how do we work with different and celebrate the different? But it just like, it's like hitting that home, And again, I think younger generations are smoothing that out. So if we can talk a little bit about the How We Get Through course, because it feels like maybe the best place to start. And then you also have your own parenting course that dives more into like really walking a parent through this whole process. But I'm just wondering if like, where are some places to start if a parent is wondering if their child is neurodivergent?
Yeah, so the first place to start logistically is talking to your pediatrician. The first place to start, like mental wellness wise for you, is checking what scares you. So I'll start with the logistics of it. This really depends on where you live. It could be talking to your pediatrician who may be on top of it and who may have seen lots of autistic young children. And it may be, if it's a pediatrician who is honestly in an older generation, may just be used to pinpointing more moderate to severe presentations of autism, and so may not see it or may say, oh, let's just wait and see. So if you have a gut feeling of like something's different about their speech and language, something's different about their movement, something's different about their sleep, like this kid does not sleep, there are lots of kids that don't sleep for a variety of reasons, but sometimes that emotional regulation can be a part of difficulty sleeping. So if your gut is like, something is different about how my kid plays and connects and communicates, talk to an occupational therapist or a speech and language pathologist, even if your pediatrician is like, I think you're good, because they've seen a lot of kids that have ADHD, that just have developmental delays in general, or have a diagnosis of autism, and they're going to be able to just give you more objective feedback. Because the minute that we are wondering or worried that our child is autistic, we've lost our objectivity. It's gone. You're not getting it back because you are going to go back and forth between, and I've been through this myself, you're going to go back and forth between, I'm worried about them, I want to get the best for them, but maybe it's not there. Maybe it's fine. And then you're not taking action to support them. And that all gets really clouded in our fears as parents. Mm-hmm. We're all fearful as parents. We just have to keep trying to ground ourselves and center ourselves and not, make decisions from a place of fear, but make decisions from a more informed place, which usually means leaning on some professionals who are able to be objective in those situations and able to tell us, does this look developmentally appropriate, or does this look like my kid might need some extra support with this?
Yeah. And I'm so curious of like the data or the numbers around, I just feel like I can imagine like parents who have outsiders or a pediatrician or somebody say that, hey, I think your child might be neurodivergent or autistic, right? Like, is that typically how it happens more often? I mean, you were an expert in it, and so you could see the signs, but I'm just curious of, not maybe like parents have blinders, but either aren't educated on it, or it just feels like such a shock that someone else is kind of observing. Because I think in the parent realm, it's like we're always, for me, I'm like, I'm like observing what's happening. But it's also just like sometimes an outsider is like, oh, that's interesting. Like they don't make eye contact with my kids. Like what, I'm just curious, but I'm not going to say that to someone, but like in family members or with other friends. So I'm just curious of like what that like, how that happens, or if that's like the majority of like someone else commenting on your child.
Yeah. So I think you might have concerns first, but also I think that in many situations, a preschool teacher is the first one to say something, or a really good friend of yours is the first person to say something. And it's harder to see this stuff if the presentation is milder, right? So your kid's speaking, they're really intelligent, but there are specific patterns that you can look for. For instance, if a child, if their interest is in reading, my son in particular taught himself to read at 3. Like, that's not a very neurotypical thing to do. And so that's even amazing. Though it's like, oh my God, he's so smart, I'm like, that's unusual. Yeah. So there are things like that many parents feel like, oh, they're so smart, which might be true, but it's sometimes a signal of this brain may be developing in an asynchronous way that's different from a neurotypical brain that, and we call it asynchronous, but it's only asynchronous because we think of neurotypical as being synchronous.
We're comparing
it's just, they're just two different ways, right? Mm-hmm. So, but what I mean when I say asynchronous is like higher skills here and lots of needs for support over here, as opposed to your kid kind of all having their skills in that average range, and that average range is just continuing to improve. So yes, sometimes we might lose our judgment and not, like, we're with our child all the time. We may not see it. Sometimes when it's your first child or you have an only child, it can be harder to figure out. That's why sometimes it is a classroom teacher who says something about it. And honestly, the first reaction of most parents is defensiveness, because we feel like it's all our baggage from autism being stigmatized, but it's a defensiveness of like, really? I think my kid's fine. Like, really? And then like immediately we layer on top of it. Sometimes we might have had a gut feeling that something was off, but we couldn't put our finger on it. But then a layer on top of that, if we didn't have that gut feeling, was like, oh my gosh, did I miss something? And then you feel guilty for maybe not doing something sooner. So we're all mixed up with our own emotions at the same time. We're really needing to, get clarity on what our kid needs and get organized with some therapies. And it's like this parallel process of emotional, mental wellness and progress we're making to accept this new journey that we're on, and then showing up for our kid at the same time and making sure those happen. So that's why I wanted to make this mini course, because that's the part that sometimes stops people from getting going with all the learning of like, okay, so I'm on this journey. How do I parent this child? And that's what my course is about. Like, I'm here for it. I'll teach you all the things, but you've got to be kind of ready for that and ready to jump into doing things in a different way than how you were raised or how you disciplined or how you thought about school. And that's all a part of this, like noticing your own fear or maybe your defensiveness. And it gets really tricky because there could be all kinds of things that come up. Like maybe you don't like that preschool teacher and then they said this, like, you're not going to believe them. Or, maybe you're like, this is your best friend. And so you do trust them that has said this, but you have to think about, well, what does she know? So there are all kinds of things that our brain immediately tries to defend ourselves against, and that's natural. But we want to really try to keep our kid at the forefront and say, okay, maybe there is a skill here that needs to be supported, and maybe they're right. So let me at least get a professional opinion about it, because not only do we have our judgment or our perspective that's like really clouded because we live with our kid and we love our kid and it's really hard to be objective. We also got opinions about whoever that person is that said that thing, because we're probably already in some sort of a relationship dynamic with them. So that's why it's really great to talk to a professional, even if it's for like a developmental screening. Lots of public preschools have developmental screenings, or depends on where you are, or just talking to your pediatrician about things.
Yeah. Why is it so important to get early intervention? Like what are we missing if we don't, or if we're like kind of getting caught up in our own stuff?
Yeah. So there's a lot of research around just neuroplasticity before age 5 or 6 and how much growth kids can make when we really get in there with speech and language therapy and occupational therapy, and sometimes physical therapy if there are coordination weaknesses. That said, I have seen kids gain exceptional skills after the age of 6. So I think the jury's still out on like the individuality of all the things kids can learn, because they're continuing to develop. Our brains aren't fully developed till we're 25. And I think the pendulum swung way over to like, get all the early intervention before age 6. And that is true. And that's all good, that's when brains are the most open to learning. But at the same time, I think that some parents can feel some panic or feel burdened by like blitzing their kid with a bunch of interventions. And this is why I speak sometimes about and write sometimes about having too many therapies, because there is such a thing as having too many therapies, just like you overschedule your child with extracurricular activities. We have to find a balance between them being tired and them being engaged. And if they are having so many, some children will have a therapy every day. And if they have so many therapies that they are starting to get resistant to it, that's defeating the purpose. And we have to sometimes streamline, okay, working on one thing at a time or working on two things at a time. And we do have time. I don't want people to get so overwhelmed with like this sense of urgency, which a lot of the research over the last 20 years really, brought that home and talked about that a lot. And it is true, but I have absolutely seen growth continue to happen after those ages.
Yeah. What a relief, because parenting is hard enough.
Right.
So, but right. I think that like, here are resources, but really, again, stay attuned to your child, right? And how are they doing? How are they feeling? What are they going through? What are you going through? Because it is like this system that needs to work together and need to flow together. And how, again, it's a little bit of like that connection piece or that community piece, but this isn't, I think, the identified patient in the family as well. It's like welcoming us all together as a family unit and how we all work together for all of our special needs in that way. Even though it can be really exhausting or having one child need more than the other child. But again, it's still like we're all in this together and we all can support and love each other through it.
Right. Right. And so much of what our kids will go through will ebb and flow. And there will be times where it's really, really hard and then times where it gets better. And that's always changing with development. And recognizing that is healthy to remember, okay, I think that this is a hard patch, but also recognizing if you're in a spot where this is not sustainable, we have to do something to help. Maybe it's a behavior or maybe it is a sleep thing that like nobody's getting sleep. That's not sustainable. There's some times where you really have to prioritize fixing something that is, really making things hard on your child's development or happiness or the family unit. And yeah. those are top priorities.
Yeah, totally. Love it. Awesome. Dr. Emily, you are the best. I think part of like why I wanted to create this app too is to find experts like you, because a lot of times it was hard being a therapist and people asking for certain things or asking for experts. I'm like, I have no idea. I am not in this niche. And so having you come on and really shed so much light, I think for me, but also for the people listening, of course, in the app, it's how we all can work together because there's so many different, we're so unique. We need different things and specialized therapies, but education. So just thank you so much for your work that you do with schools and with parents and being that middle road in between. Just thank you so much. Can you tell everyone where to find you if they want to take your parent course?
Yes. So you can go to learnwithdremily.com/parents. Or on the main website, learnwithdremily.com, you can find links to my Substack blog and my podcast. And if you want to pass resources on to your child's teachers, there are resources there.
Ooh, that's good. That's good. Awesome. And we'll put those in the show notes as well. So awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Emily. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thanks for listening to our show. We hope we were able to give you support in advocating for your neurodivergent kid. If you're curious if your child has autism, check out Dr. Emily's 30-minute course on the How We Get Through app, available for both Android and iPhone. And if you have a friend who could really use some support in this area, make sure to share this podcast episode with them. Next week on the pod, we are diving deep into the spectrum of postpartum emotions with a licensed counselor, Christine Page. We have a real, honest conversation about everything from the minor anxieties to the scariest thoughts that cross our minds during this stage of motherhood. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss a show. Thanks, and we'll see you then.